This week on General Hospital, the show asked us to care about Mike's impending death. Just like last week, and last month, and last spring, and for like the last 2 years. Dear GH, we need to talk. Welcome to the second episode of Crimson Suds. First, I just want to thank everybody who watched and left a comment on my first video. I had a lot of fun making it, so it was really great to see that you guys enjoyed watching it. Second, I am going to be a little snarky at times about this story, but I want to be upfront by saying that the reason I chose it, that this story means a lot to me, and I'm going to be complimentary to the show where it deserves it, and I'm going to be critical where the show also deserves it, because I think this was a story that I would have remembered for the next 20 years. I would have loved to have talked about this story the way that other people talk about BJ's death, the way that I remember Georgie's death, the way that I still feel about Stone's death. This story could have been all of that to me, but it's not, and I wanted to kind of think about why. I wanted to be upfront about the fact that I am going to be a little snarky, and I am going to be very critical, but that's because I care. If you haven't guessed already, this week I'm going to talk about the current A story on General Hospital, the final days of Mike Corbin. I am going to talk about this story in several sections. First, I want to talk generally about the character of Mike on the show and our relationship as an audience to him, because believe it or not, we did have a relationship with him before 2018. Then I'm going to break down the story in 3 parts. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Finally, I will discuss the overall impact of this story and what a potential legacy might be. Like, what are we going to think about this story in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years? In January 1995, Ron Hale joined the cast of General Hospital as the gambling deadbeat father of mobster Sonny Corinthos. He had abandoned Sonny and his mother Adela when Sonny was just a child, and Sonny did not see him again until he was an adult. I'm going to ask you to hold on to that fact because it will be relevant later. During Ron's first 15 years with the show, he never enjoyed front burner status. When he first joined, the writers were slightly more invested in his relationship with Sonny, so we got a lot of the best material at that point. Mike is actually present for some of the big moments in Sonny's life during that time period. He's at Luke's, where he was working as a bartender, and he, along with Luke, are holding Sonny back when Lily dies in the car explosion that also took their unborn child. That is kind of the high point of Mike's character as his own entity. Maurice left the show in September 1997 in a memorable wedding that wasn't, when he left Brenda literally at the altar. He never showed up, and she was so convinced that he would that she walked down the aisle, and that was a really devastating thing for all of us to watch. Especially I was 13 and I still very much believed in love and like happiness, and I really thought that even though I knew Sonny was leaving the show and I knew Brenda wasn't, I was like, oh, maybe. And no, Brenda got devastated. Sonny left the show at that point for over a year, and the writers were never really kind of engaged in Mike as a character again, at least not on General Hospital. Mike lurked in the background for most of the 90s, bartending at Luke's, and then he moved on to manage Kelly's Diner in the last decade he was on the show. He crossed over to Port Charles, the GH spinoff, where he operated the recovery room bar where all the interns went to drink, and he dated Mary Scanlon. In late 2001, the show introduced Courtney Matthews, another child that Mike had fathered and abandoned. And if you're noticing a pattern to Mike's approach to parenting, hold on to that. It'll be relevant later. Mike and Sonny were never truly close during Mike's time on the show, and after Courtney's death in 2006, Mike largely disappeared into the background. He resurfaced briefly in 2008 when the Russians attacked him and burned down Kelly's, and then in 2009, he rented a room to Dante, who was an undercover cop trying to bring Sonny down from inside the organization. Then in 2010, Mike fell off the wagon with regards to his gambling, and he was beaten by his bookies. With his addiction spiraling, he stepped down from managing Kelly's, and with Sonny's help, he checked into rehab and left town. Ron Hale retired from acting in 2010, and Mike faded from memory, rarely, if ever, mentioned by the characters, including his on-screen son and any grandchildren. Until early 2018, when Max Gale joined the show in the role of Mike Corbin. At that point, the character displayed early signs of dementia, so we knew almost immediately what story we were in for. For the last 2 years, the show has asked us to care about him, his family, and his inevitable death. This would be fine, except I'm not sure that anyone currently writing the show has ever watched Ron Hale's tenure, because they have ignored his entire character history. Which, to be fair, also describes the way the writers approach every other character on this show, so hey, at least they're consistent. apart this story in excruciating detail. Let me begin first with what works, because some of the story is not terrible. In fact, some of it's really good, even by my admittedly high standards. First, the acting. Every single actor in this story is doing career best work, particularly Max Gail and Maurice Benard. This is Maurice Benard's best story and best performance since the original AJ murder in 2014. You can tell that he genuinely enjoys the writing and his co-stars. I am not a current Sonny fan, but I am an old school Sonny fan, and there are times when I am reminded of the character that I loved all of those years ago, and it makes me hope that we can still get a version of that man back. In addition, it's also just nice seeing Maurice enjoy the writing, because he's definitely an actor who thrives with really good material and investment in the story. Max Gail is also really nailing this performance, and absolutely none of the problems I have with the story are about the acting. You can't actually always say that on soap operas. You can't even say that about this show 90% of the time. So it's important to give credit where it's due. The supporting cast is also turning in impeccable work. Laura Wright's Carly, Steve Burton's Jason, Eda McCoy's Joss, Rebecca Hurst Elizabeth, Mark Samuels Felix, and Vernee Watson Stella have also nailed every single scene they've been given. I want to highlight a specific set of scenes because it is a perfect example of what this show and the performers are doing right with this story and what I would love to see more from in the future. In early August, when the show returned from the COVID shutdown, Sonny and Elizabeth were discussing the possibility of fitting Mike with a feeding tube. Sonny had initially been in favor of anything that would give Mike more time, but he later became conflicted. He was struggling with the decision, and Elizabeth talked him through it. She even quoted Mary May Ward as told to her by Lucky Spencer, which was a nice touch of history and masterfully done. I say this because, as the audience who was there very well knows, Elizabeth never knew Mary May Ward. But Lucky and the Spencers absolutely did, and Lucky might have actually passed this kind of quote on to her, because that was who Lucky was in the 1990s. And the Spencers were very close to Mary May before she died in January of 1996, and she is still, 24 years later, deeply, deeply, deeply missed. Sonny and Elizabeth were once frequent scene partners, but they have not shared any meaningful screen time in more than a decade. In 2001, the show briefly considered rewriting Elizabeth as Sonny's sister, and you can see why with the comfortable, almost sibling-like chemistry the performers share. I hope that the show sees this chemistry and capitalizes on it by giving them more material together. Not a relationship. I want to be very clear. Nobody wants Sonny and Elizabeth romantically. I'm good. The positive piece of feedback I want to offer is that the depiction of Alzheimer's and dementia has also been extraordinarily well done. The extent to which invested in the story hangs heavily on this aspect. My grandmother began to experience symptoms of dementia in 2015, but we were fortunate that her decline was slow. However, around the time the show kicked off the Mike storyline, my grandmother began to rapidly lose her memory. In January, she still mostly knew me, but by April, that was no longer true. On March 31st, 2018, the show celebrated its 55th anniversary by trying to recreate Luke's and give Mike a night of memories. I actually wrote a version of this story that I'm going to link below in case you're interested, drawing on my own experiences with my grandmother, particularly the guilt and worry that my family and I felt, and the way that conversations with my grandmother would dip in and out of time and lucidity. It was discombobulating to see and experience, and it's something that I wanted to try and represent on page. That was actually the last time I wrote anything about Mike's story in my own fan fiction, because as I stated, I wrote that aired on March 31st. I wrote it that same day, and then my grandmother passed away on April 21st, 3 weeks later. Watching the story became so much more difficult after that. There was a scene later that August when Mike told Sonny he wishes he was better off dead, and that really hit me hard. Because I had literally had that conversation with my grandmother, and she had said those exact words, and it was just jarring and incredibly upsetting, and I almost couldn't breathe. I had to stop watching the show for just a minute, and I had to take it in. I remember later, actually, I tweeted at Maurice saying, like, this was such a beautiful episode, and he replied with a like, because it reminded me of my grandmother. One of the things I have really, really appreciated is the care that they have taken with what Mike is going through, because showing that frustration of what it's like for the person suffering it is something that I don't often see in these stories. It's usually about the family, but here they really took a minute to give Mike the space. There were moments when my grandmother was lucid enough to know that whatever she couldn't remember was something that she should know. And she would get so frustrated. It was so upsetting for her to know that in a couple of minutes, she would not be there again and she would forget. And that scene, I'm going to say later something about how I'm not going to remember the story in 5 years, and that's a spoiler. But this scene I will remember for the rest of my life, because I have never in my life watched anything where I had to stop and just take a minute because it felt so real that I couldn't breathe. I think it's important for me to really state how much I want this story to succeed and how much this part of it has meant the world to me. What we went through, what my grandmother went through, what I go through every day not having her, and not only not having her, but having those final months stolen from me. That's the horror of what Alzheimer's and dementia and these kind of diseases they do when they steal the person and they're just there, but they're not there anymore. And the last time I was ever with my grandmother, she didn't know me. And I always kind of had this thought in the back of my head that I might be the last person she knew because of how much she meant to me. I thought I was special somehow, and I wasn't, and that was so hard. I think it's important for me to take this time to compliment this show because I have often been accused of being very, very snarky and very, very dismissive and very, very cranky. This is why I love General Hospital, because this genre, this show does this, where it brings, it's been 2.5 years since I lost her, and just, I can still bring it back to myself. I can still remember it. I want anybody watching this to see what this story means to me, what I wanted it to mean. And I also want to say how difficult I am making this, not having watched what I think are Michael's final episodes. And it's not, I've been snarky about it, like, oh, I don't want to watch General Hospital because I'm just like, I don't have time for that. I'm just like, I don't know if I'm ready emotionally to watch Mike die. I don't know. I really saw my grandmother in Mike's character, especially in that scene, and I saw myself in Sonny. And that is probably the first and only time I am ever going to identify with Sonny frickin' Corinthos as a character. Well done. The depiction of this disease, the stress it puts on family, and the person suffering. This has been first-class work. When you care about the source material the way that somebody on that staff clearly does, you can do such good work. Ultimately, because this part of the story has been so well done, it makes my overall disappointment all the more upsetting. The fact that I can't enjoy this story, it breaks my heart in a way that I'm not sure I really confronted until I sat down to really think about why pieces of this story affect me the way that you've just seen, and why overall it's lost its impact. I don't know yet how much it's going to stay with me. The final positive that I want to highlight is the character of Brando Corbin. I might have some issues with the overall introduction of the Corbin family, and we'll get to it, but I quite like the actor and the way he's been folded into the show thus far. His one-night stand with Molly gave DJ and Molly relationship new life, which we desperately needed, because I'm not sure that they've had an actual conflict since 2013 when TJ slept with Felix's sister. I have been intrigued also by sparks with Sam. Kelly Monaco and Johnny Wachter have a really interesting chemistry. I'd be interested in seeing where it goes. While I doubt I'm going to get a Sam and Brando relationship because I'm not allowed to have nice things that cheer me up, this is the first time since Patrick in 2014 and 15 that I've been even mildly engaged in Sam's story and potential relationships, so they really should not waste that. Some time being, nice to the show and highlighting the really excellent aspects of the story, let's talk about some of the problems. I'm going to start with the merely irritating and work my way up to the egregious, which is the primary reason I can't let this story mean more to me. Let's start off with the least of our problems, which is Dev. He is an undocumented immigrant teen, and he needed help to stay in the country, so Sonny turned to the character of Gladys Corbin, a cousin of Mike's, to give Dev family on paper. Dev is a flop. The teen scene is great. Joss, Cameron, and Trina are doing really great work, and Dev is there. They either need to connect him to history, they need to give him something interesting about his personality, they need to give me a reason to care about this kid, because at the moment, the writers seem as uninterested in him as we are. I can live with irritating characters. It's General Hospital. There's no other choice. That's why he's at this bottom of this list. The next kind of irritant is the retconning of Mike's history with the Corbin name. Mike's birth name is Michael Corinthos. Sonny is Michael Corinthos Jr. And Michael is Michael Corinthos III. Until 2018, it was largely assumed that Corbin was a false identity, but with the introduction of Gladys and Brando, we are now expected to believe differently. I guess we can retcon this by saying that Mike pulled the Corbin name from another branch of the family tree, but it just speaks for me to an overall lack of care with history. It is difficult for me to give the show the benefit of the doubt because I don't trust them that they remember Mike Corbin is not his real name, and my lack of trust is because I've been burned before. The complete lack of care they give to all of the characters' history, it just means I don't trust them anymore. But I just want to say that the handling of the Corbin name and Corbin family doesn't really work for me. If they have addressed the fact that Mike Corbin is not his actual name on the show, please let me know. I must have missed it, and nobody on my Twitter timeline has noticed it either. And then the final kind of irritant I want to talk about is the story structure. Just literally, what are we doing here? The story starts in January 2018, and here we are, September 2020. This is not necessarily General Hospital's fault. Dementia and Alzheimer's are not diseases that have a natural end. It's not like cancer where you can say, well, you have 3 months to live, where you have a heart out, so to speak. You don't have a time lock. People can live for a very long time, or if they're like my grandmother, can live a very short time. She showed symptoms for a couple of years, but for the most part was able to function relatively normally, and we were able to compensate. But Christmas 2019 was kind of the last holiday where I really can say she was there, and then she was gone. Sorry, Christmas 2017, and then she was gone in April 2018. So it can be that fast, and then it can also very, 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 very slow, and that's something that's really hard for a soap opera. I understand that The Young and the Restless is having a similar endgame issue with Dina Abbott. So I think that this just the fact that the show never really committed to how long they were going to have Mike on screen. If he had been here for 6 years, it would have been interesting to see if they could have gotten Ron Hale out of retirement instead of a recast. Again, I have no problems with Max Gale. I just think that with a character like Mike, who was a peripheral character, if you want me to feel bad for him dying and really feel emotionally connected, trying to get the original actor back would have helped me a little bit. I can't speak for everybody. So let's break down Mike's story and just where it's gone since January of 2018, where it's gone wrong, and if it's gone right. So his story began very, very promising for me. They kind of really quickly came to terms with the diagnosis. They put together ideas for treatment and care. And then we started the first of our detours. And I think that this was an attempt to make it into an umbrella story. And I'm not entirely sure the show understands what an umbrella story is. We learned that Mike hid the body of Mike's first mob kill in the basement of Charlie's Pub, which is now owned by Julian. And this was back in the 1980s. Apparently, Mike knew the original Charlie who did him a favor. This subplot was wasted time and energy for a couple of reasons, and like I said, we don't really have the time to get into because it's a mess all on its own. Let me just point out the continuity issues that give me pause and kind of trip me up a little bit with the story. First, this is a minor issue, I'll be the first to admit it, and I likely would have ignored it entirely if I weren't thinking critically about the story. For me, it's hard to believe that Mike had such strong ties to Port Charles back in the 1980s, considering he didn't arrive until the 90s, and he never really, for me, appeared to have familiarity with the town. But I honestly can't remember if this is something that was or was not previously established. This is actually the most important continuity problem I have. Mike did not know Sonny at this time in his life. He again abandoned Sonny as a child and did not see him again until Sonny was an adult. I told you earlier to remember that fact. We were told that canonically in 1995 when Mike came to Port Charles. And when I say canonically, I mean literally in an episode, Sonny said the following: "I have not seen that man since I was a child." Or words to that effect. Once that subplot fizzled out, and like I said, we can't get into it. We do not have the time for the problems that were the DA, Margot, whose name I never learned to spell because I cared about her as little as the show did. We took a second detour, which was mildly better, but still ultimately dissatisfying. Mike fell in love with a nursing home patient who was suffering from Alzheimer's. Yvonne was the wife of Marcus, a man that Stella, who was Mike's social worker and Curtis's aunt, had once dated and broken up with to raise her nephews. We all thought, like, hey, all right, Mike and Yvonne, now Stella will get a little bit of love. All right, let's do this. And then, no, that story mostly faded, and Yvonne and Marcus disappeared. They were briefly mentioned in August of 2020 when Felix, in violation of the HIPAA laws, which is something that apparently is just letters on this show, Felix told Sonny that Yvonne had been fitted with a feeding tube on Marcus's directions, and then she had suffered a complication. As a result, she was in General Hospital, restrained to her bed. This is the news that pushed Sonny to reconsider a feeding tube for Mike, leading to the Elizabeth scenes that I mentioned earlier in the video. So I will say that of the two subplots, it had a mild influence on the Mike story, Yvonne and Marcus, but this was long after Yvonne and Marcus had been featured on the show. A lot of momentum had been lost. And that is kind of the thesis of the problem with the story. It kept losing momentum. The story has been unfocused since 2018. It has meandered. It has taken detours that ultimately carried no weight or consequences that informed Mike's story or changed the lives of characters. And often, the story just disappeared from us entirely. Asking me to emotionally invest in the story while shoving it off the screen for weeks and months at a time is poor pacing and exceptionally poor plotting, which is a common theme on the show. We talked about it in the first episode. We've talked about the good, we've talked about the bad. Now it's time to talk about the ugly. What particularly makes this story a tragic miss for me. Why? Even though obviously I feel very deeply about certain aspects of the story, I ultimately can't let myself just enjoy it. While the story is structurally shaky, the character of Dev is a flop, and the retconning of the Corbin name is frustrating. Ultimately, these are just irritants, and I probably would not have noticed them or thought about them if it wasn't for the final insult. This story spends nearly every minute on screen gaslighting viewers about Mike Corbin and the life he built before Port Charles and during his time on the show. The extent to which audiences ever liked Mike was due primarily to the portrayer Ron Hale, who longtime soap viewers knew as Roger Coleridge from Ryan's Hope. Ron was a charming performer who always made the most of whatever he was given, and I genuinely enjoyed his contributions to the show, as limited as they were. If you know me, you know that Courtney Matthews is one of my least favorite characters in the history of the world. I actually like Sam so much better than Courtney, because at least Sam has a character. She's desperate and dumb. These are her character traits. Courtney was nothing. We'll talk about it in another video. I celebrated when she died, until I watched Mike mourn Courtney. The extent to which I ever gave a damn about Courtney's death in a way that affected me was watching her father on the rooftop of General Hospital, wondering why he had been allowed to survive and his daughter had not. You know, mourning the fact that she was never going to get to see her miracle baby grow up, who grew up into Spencer. So I guess we've been punished in lots of ways. I'm so sorry. I actually like Spencer. I apologize. That is kind of the last real moment I remember of Mike on his own. So when I say I liked Mike, I want you to know that I liked Mike. And I was not alone. A lot of viewers liked Mike because we liked Ron and we liked his acting. Sonny was never close to Mike. Mike disappeared when Sonny was a child and abandoned him entirely. He did not drift in and out of Sonny's life. He was not there to cover up Sonny's first hit, and he had little to do with Sonny even after Mike came to Port Charles. Mike was a gambling addict that was constantly relapsing, and Sonny was always bailing him out. And he was not bailing him out of any real true sense of love or familial loyalty. He was Sonny Corinthos, that was his father, and everybody knew it, and it was more of a point of pride for him. And I'm not saying that because I'm a frustrated viewer. I'm saying that as I watched the show. Canonically, that is how Sonny always approached the character of Mike. After a certain point, Mike simply ceased to exist in Sonny's world. After Courtney's death in February 2006, he was only brought in to increase this threat to Sonny when the Russians came to town in 2008. And Mike's final story was another gambling relapse that ultimately sent him out of town. Another reminder of the weakness that Mike had suffered from all of Sonny's life. He never had a relationship with any of his grandchildren, meaningfully on screen or even referred to off screen. If they had brought Mike back in 2018 and the entire story had been Sonny coming to terms with the fact that he had turned away this chance to really know his father, and he would never have the opportunity to change that, I could have signed up for that because that would have resonated to me. It also could have bonded the Corinthos family as a unit, particularly Christina, who has drifted away from Sonny. Instead, the show lies. It lies to us over and over again. We pretended last week that Joss ever gave a damn about the man that she used to call Mike. And this is nothing against, the actress. Ida McCoy, as I said, I could almost believe that she loved Mike, but I had also watched the show. And that's the gaslighting, is that I'm watching characters who never gave a damn about Mike pretend they ever did. And the show is pretending that that's all true. And it makes you start to doubt yourself as a viewer. What is the point of watching the show if what I'm watching doesn't matter? And the problem with that scene with Joss is not the acting, because Eden is amazing. It's that it should have been Christina. Joss is not Sonny's daughter. His stepdaughter, and he loves her, but that relationship to Mike doesn't exist. Sonny's actual daughter, Christina, isn't anywhere to be found. She's the granddaughter that nearly died in the gas explosion Mike accidentally set in 2018 at Charlie's. But she's been absent. Michael spent time in the park talking to Willow about his grandfather, waxing poetic about a relationship that none of us ever saw, and we know did not exist. Something I find personally irritating because it illustrates the larger problem of Carly and how the writers misunderstand her to the point of insult is the idea that Carly is a dutiful and devoted daughter-in-law. Carly shared maybe 5 scenes with Mike during the entirety of her relationship with Sonny from 1999 through 2004 when they finally divorced. And like 3 of those scenes were the time that Mike got beat up by the bookies and Carly tried to get everybody out of trouble and ended up setting Sonny up for drug trafficking. So like, it's not a fond memory. Laura writes Carly in particular was never part of Mike's life because Sonny and Carly were divorced from 2004 through I think 2015. Do you know whose emotions and grief I would actually buy? And I know that he had scenes with Mike on Today's General Hospital, September 14th, which I haven't watched yet. I buy Jason's because Mike worked with Jason when Jason was parking cars at Luke's, and Jason often interceded with Sonny on Mike's behalf. And Jason named Mike as Michael's godfather in January 98, which was months after Sonny had left, which tells us that Jason and Mike still had a relationship. Jason was also married to Mike's daughter, which, though it is a nightmare that I try to forget, apparently it did happen. But thanks to AJ, not legal. But none of these things are memories that the show is relying on. And I think what really offends me is Sonny. Sonny keeps pretending he ever had a positive relationship with Mike. And longtime viewers know this is a lie. I am not talking about 95 through 2010 where you could say Sonny had like a mild, if irritated, affection for Mike. Fine, I will grant you that possibly he had kind of started to soften towards him, but we wouldn't know it because they weren't on screen together. I'm talking about the lie that Sonny has fond memories of Mike from his childhood. That's just not true. Mike abandoned him and he never saw him again. Like, I know I keep coming back to it, but it matters because of the next thing I'm about to say. Sonny blamed Mike for abandoning his mother Adela, who ended up married and later killed by an abusive husband. Sonny himself was also the target of Deke's abusive behavior. He locked him in closets, which gave Sonny his fear of dark spaces. Sonny never truly forgave Mike for that, and if he did, it was in a scene that I didn't watch, and again, I watched for the first 15 years of Mike being on, so like, I don't know how I missed it. Instead, the show has decided to retcon Sonny and Mike's relationship by suggesting that Mike was in and out of Sonny's life, even attempting to talk him out of working for Joe Scully. Retcon stands for retroactive continuity, and this is a tool that writers pull out usually in an attempt to adjust or fix something perceived as a mistake or a faux pas in earlier episodes. This is not a standard retcon. This is not, oh, we never mentioned this. This is something more deceptive and ultimately more damaging to the trust that an audience needs to have in their writers, particularly a soap opera audience. We don't watch for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 seasons. We watch for decades. We watch for generations. That's how soap audiences grow. I watched this show at my mother's knee. Like, well, not knee, because I was not that young, but I watched her VHS tapes. I stole them from her. My grandmother watched General Hospital. Like, I would have my sister and I were watching. My sister doesn't watch anymore. I would have loved to have passed it on to my nieces and my nephews. But if what I watched 10 years ago doesn't matter, what's the point? Why think about history? Why not? Why invest all of this time 5 days a week for years in a show that does not care about the time I put into the show? It is damaging to take away that trust and to tell me it doesn't matter what I saw 5 minutes. It doesn't matter what I saw last year. It doesn't matter what I saw in 2005. It doesn't matter. And if it doesn't matter, then I guess I don't have to watch, because in 5 years, it's not, first of all, it's not going to be on the screen. It's not going to be on. But next year, it doesn't matter, right? The show is lying to us. It's gaslighting us. It pretends that the Mike Corbin we knew and actually enjoyed did not exist at all. It's replaced him with a version of the character that is basically unrecognizable to longtime viewers who are already fleeing the show in droves. We don't need another shove out the door. Stop telling us we don't matter. We get it. So why ultimately am I making this video? Why am I feeling less than satisfied with the story? I don't know how much of the section where I talk about my grandmother is going to stay in. At the moment, it's about 8 minutes long, and I feel like that's going to be too long. And if you watch it, you know that I cried, and like this story means me. It does mean a lot to me in some ways, but ultimately not enough. And I think it's important for me to figure out why. And a lot of it is about the gaslighting I talked about in the last section, but let me just sum it up and talk about why does it matter that this story fails for me? Like, why does it matter? So let's break that down. Considering how well the story has been performed and the genuinely beautiful, moving depiction of dementia and its effect on the family, the fact that this story for me is not going to be something I remember in 5 years' time, outside of that one scene I know that really broke me. The fact that this story outside of that one scene is not going to be something I really hold on to the way that I have thought about Stone's death for my entire life is the greatest tragedy of all. Personally, I don't think that Mike's death was ever really going to hit me the way that Stone did, the way that Georgie and Emily and Edward and Lila, the way that those deaths really stayed with me. Stone's death is one of my earliest memories on watching the show. It set the tone for what I was looking for in a soap opera. The emotional impact of stories, the relationships with the characters, and just the way things could resonate. I hadn't watched Stone's entire storyline. I just watched the day he died. And it's just stayed with me ever since. Possibly because in the years since I have watched more of that storyline thanks to YouTube and other clips. Even when I hadn't watched large portions of their storylines, I have never forgotten Stone's final moments. Georgie and Emily were characters I had watched growing up, and they were both characters that I write constantly in my own stories. So when they died, the way they died, the closeness, they were both killed by the serial killer in 2007 within weeks of each other. I am still emotionally devastated and wrecked by all of that. And losing Edward and Lila, 8 years apart, were like losing TV grandparents, especially Edward. John Ingle died a day or two before his final performance on General Hospital, and whew. So Mike was never going to be a character that really hit me this way, but he was still a familiar character that I and a lot of other viewers have a fondness for. At one time, losing Mike would have hit me the way that Tony did in 2006. Tony's final vision of BJ smiling broke me, and I had not really been watching General Hospital at that time. I've watched all of the BJ stuff since. YouTube is a beautiful place. But I cried like a baby when that aired, and I wasn't even really all that invested in Tony by that point. When Mike dies, you can bring back Courtney. You can bring back Alicia Lee Willis for a guest spot, and I will not complain. Because, one, that is a relationship that I actually believe in. I watched Mike and Courtney. He comforted her. That was Mike's best relationship on this show, and it was one that the writers actually were invested in. And two, bringing Courtney back as a ghost always reminds me that she's dead, and it makes me, ridiculously happy. I really hate Courtney. I'm really sorry. You could have done that, and that probably would help. I don't think that they're going to do that. The show does not care what relationship we had with Mike. It was not interested in building on the existing connection or engaging with his history in a way that would inform character choices or give us story options. All they care about is the now. And the now is all they're gonna get. I will probably cry watching the scenes where he dies. I'm a sensitive person, and you can see that the story does still have an impact on me. But then I'm mostly gonna forget it. I think that it's just not going to hit me. I will forget it as quickly as the writers have forgotten that General Hospital existed for decades before Frank Valentini and his clown car of actors and characters showed up in 2012. Stop hiring new people. Worry about the ones we already love. The Mike storyline is indicative of the toxic relationship General Hospital has with its audience. And if that sounds dramatic, it probably should. The show does not trust the viewers, and judging by the outright gaslighting in this storyline, it doesn't respect us either. Because of my experience, I was ready for this to be the best GH storyline for me. I have 5 of my top favorite storylines. It's Elizabeth's rape. It's the storyline that brought me to the show and kept me. It's what made me start stealing my mother's VHS tapes. The eventual Lucky and Elizabeth romance because I was 15 and I wanted a Lucky. Emily's death. Jason's accident. The Metro Court hostage crisis. AJ's new relationship with Michael in 2012 through 2014. I love that. I would have happily added this story to that list. I'm not going to. Really should have been in that top 5. That one scene alone should have put it there, but I can't ultimately give that kind of space and time to a story that doesn't matter in the show. It doesn't. The fact that I can't let it be one of my favorite stories because of how much it lies to me and refuses to acknowledge that anything I ever knew about Mike ever mattered. And that's not something a show should ever do. The show should tell me that my time matters. And by lying to me and gaslighting me about who Mike Corbin was, it tells me my time isn't valuable. And if my time isn't valuable, I'm not giving it to you. So no, this storyline doesn't go on my all-time best lists. I'm sorry. It doesn't change that the actors were amazing. It doesn't change how beautifully they approached Alzheimer's and dementia. It doesn't change any of that for me. That feedback still stands. I am incredibly impressed. It also makes me angry because you guys can do this. You guys can do the work. And I don't understand why you don't. The show's been on for 56 years. My grandmother watched this show. My mother still does. I still do. for better or for worse. A lot of my favorite people in the world still watch this show. I want to one day pass it on to my nieces. I just don't know that I think that they should spend their time. The show doesn't think that my time is valuable. This story doesn't matter. It's not going to matter in 5 years, and so I'm not going to give it any more time. But thank you for that scene. Thank you for that scene, and thank you to Maurice Menard and Max Gale for the acting in that scene, for making me 6 months after I lost my grandmother feel like I'd lost her all over again. And it's crazy to thank you for that, because obviously it's upsetting. But thank you, because it reminds me of what I want from this show, and it gives me such hope that I will get it again, and that it's still there.